Hi, everyone. This week, we have just the single session, session 1.7, recognizing that you're also dealing with SA1. And to be honest, this session is of such importance that I think it deserves to be called out by itself anyway. One of the most difficult things many of us will ever experience when we go to a joint staff is the idea that, as they say in Washington, the junior captain makes coffee. It will be extraordinarily unusual for any of us when we first go to a joint staff or any large staff to be in charge. And any influence that you're going to have is really going to, as our saying goes anyway, and I think you've probably heard this before, that you're going to have to lead from the middle. And what we want to talk about in this session is ways in which you can do that, some of the problems that you may encounter, and to just barely open a small window into the incredible complexity that leading from the middle can possibly entail. I think General Dempsey gets it. I mean, he understands this when he's talking about Mission Command and how Mission Command relates to the overall world. What he really talks about in this is that if you are going to be successful, and I think he's probably talking more about operational commands here than staff work, but I think it works both ways, is that you need to understand what your boss really wants, and you need to have a sense of trust between you and the boss. And what this equates to is what he has called mission command. And what he says is it's really essential to the conduct of any kind of joint operation, either staff or actual operational work. But in order to develop effective leaders in the joint environment, we need to understand how this will work. And you'll need to understand how it works because it's likely to be very, very different from your experiences on a ship, in a squadron, or wherever. So this is a real busy chart. And I think that you will understand it almost intuitively after you get through the first couple of cells. Incredibly, we still have a lot of folks across the DoD who want to have a world of detailed command in a world that is predictable and deterministic. And if anything of the last 20 or 30 years has taught me that this is likely not to be the case, our overall experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and any number of other places says that it's probably not true. We live in a world of disorder, and as a result, we have small groups working. This is also true in large staffs. People are going to work small groups for a single commander. If you just look at the structure of a large joint staff, you see that there are a whole lot of general and flag officers in charge of very, very large organizations. And the idea that you can, in fact, have a directive system strikes me as, well, foolish. And if you are unfortunate enough to be assigned to such a command, it's likely to be very, very difficult. We also think that there's a lot of benefit to the idea of structured assessment. We don't go into structured assessment in any real way in this class, but there are a number of structured assessment tools in the world. There are different methodologies. One that's used in the resident part of the War College deals with the idea that you need to have a really good understanding of what's going on in the world around you, where your command is, where you fit in the command. You need to try and assess what needs to be done and why it needs to be done. You then need to decide on courses of action and develop a fairly comprehensive implementation plan as to why that will work. And finally, you need to find ways to make sure that you're actually accomplishing what you set out to do. I think that structured assessments are likely to do all of those things, and they do so with the kind of benefits that you see here, and probably manages to avoid leaving you in the cartoon. So the problem with all of this stuff in any even structured environment or mission behavior is that there are barriers to what we do. All of us tend to look at what we expect to be perceived. I'm often amused. My children are great fans of the Harry Potter books, and I'm astonished every time I type some of this stuff. You see what you want to see, is what Professor Dumbledore tells Professor Snape when they're talking about Harry. In fact, Snape is never really able to fully abandon that perception. And it goes to the second bullet. Once it's formed, it's really hard to change those. And any new information about whom Potter might be really is assimilated into his worldview before that. To be fair, I guess Professor Snape shows up to be somewhat of a hero at the end, but it's hard to tell that along the way. And basically, his real problem is cognitive barriers, and it exists in literature, it exists in children's literature, more interestingly, I think, and it exists in the real world as well. So, how does this happen? This is a probably horribly inadequate list of all of the different things that can happen to you. And the readings really go into this in more detail. I don't want to try and belabor the point too much, but I want to bring out that you need to understand that this happens to everybody. It doesn't just happen occasionally. One of the great examples of all of this stuff, really of almost all of the bullets that are here, was the reaction of the administration to the Pueblo capture, and then other subsequent captures of merchant ships off the coast of Vietnam. And the comparison was immediately made that this is another Pueblo and we can't let it stand. And the truth of the matter is that they probably couldn't have been more different, but because that was the frame of reference, everybody trotted off. And it was extraordinarily difficult to walk back from that. It almost certainly cost more lives than were saved, and left the administration looking rather foolish at the end of the day. We talk a little bit about behavioral economics. We don't expect you to become economists, although some of you probably have spent some time studying that. Almost all of you will be familiar with the term of the invisible hand of the market, which basically says that in aggregate, people will behave in ways to maximize their own personal benefit. And what behavioral economics says is, wait a minute, that's probably not so. That may happen sort of serendipitously in the law of averages over a large population base, but it doesn't really happen on any individual place. And we need to understand, especially as we are working within a staff or a comparable joint environment, that the people we're dealing with are not necessarily going to be calculating. They're not necessarily going to be rational. They're not necessarily going to be objective. And in fact, they are likely to be the opposite of all of these things. And if we don't understand that and deal with it, then we are likely to be less successful than might otherwise be the case. Almost all of you use heuristics, rules of thumb, shortcuts, and you use them to try and make your decision-making process a lot easier. For example, I would bet that those of you who belong to Navy Federal Credit Union didn't really explore the possibilities of other credit unions that might have served you better. This was the one that everybody used, and so it's a shortcut to a great organization. Now, I've been a member of NFCU for well over 30 years, coming up on 40 years, actually. So I believe in it, but my point is I've never questioned it. I just have a shortcut of when I have banking needs, that's where I go. And I rarely bother to check out whether there's, in fact, a lot better organization that might serve my needs. I'm doing well enough. And a heuristic basically allows you to behave that way. So I now want to just go through. This is a huge list. If you're interested in this, print it. It's available in the readings as well. Almost any of these are going to be a major impediment to being able to accomplish what you want to accomplish on your next tour. Some of those are really obvious, and some of them are really, really difficult to figure out. The Dunning-Kruger effect, confirmation bias is really, both are really important to you as you go forward, and you need to try and find ways to suspend belief. None of us are as good as we think we are, and all of us have biases which lead us to believe that we know what is best and what the real situation is. In point of fact, it's almost never true. So on the left, I've tried to list ideas. This is comes back to the brief summary I had a little bit earlier of what a really good systematic framework might be. On the right, what you see is a whole series of things that will lead to almost certain failure. In a real quick summary of the red bullets here, red buttons, what you really have is something along the lines of the ready, fire, aim approach that you see occasionally. If you've worked in an environment of engineers all your life, you can begin to see this almost always. Engineers as a class of people have brought us marvels beyond belief. But there is a tendency to jump right in and solve the problem without bothering to figure out what the problem really is or what the alternatives might be. What I often told folks when they first came to work for us and when I first had to try and address the issue of what I'll call charitably overeagerness is that you almost always would save anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months of implementation for every extra hour you spent in trying to figure out what was going on, the framing of the problem and gathering intelligence. It was truly amazing to watch people come to realize that and to behave along those lines. Okay, when you come to a major staff, you are going to be charged, or I expect you will want to try and accomplish something so that you can leave your mark. As an 04 or an 05 coming to a major staff, that's not easy. And so I'd like you to sort of print this out if you can and remember it, because without going through these steps, I do not believe you can really be successful. And you're going to come back again and again to the idea that people need to understand that your new approach, your new idea is really important. There's a sense of urgency about trying to do that, and you're going to have to get some of your buddies, people who think like you, to go along with it so that you can get a vision of what's going to happen, and that will allow you to get some actions, to undertake some actions that will lead to wins that demonstrate that you are correct, so that you can in fact consolidate and leave your mark at the end of the day. It's really, really hard to do. And if you, again, just try and plunge right in and wade ahead, you're likely to encounter more enemies than you ever thought could have existed. We talk about different kinds of power, and the readings talk about different kinds of power, and they're important for people who are leading from the middle. I think that as you look at all of these, you can understand what they might be, and I think that the reading does a really nice job of trying to talk about it. But if you are leading from the middle, then some of these simply don't apply. You don't have much in the way of coercive power. You probably don't have much in the way of representative power. What you almost certainly will have are both referent and expert power and the power of information. And these you will have gotten as you have moved forward through any particular assignment. So that I want you to think about it, because as you try and get any of your programs through the staff, you need to understand what kinds of power you do and do not have, and perhaps most importantly out of all that, to recognize that you are not powerless.